All right, ready to dive into some French grammar?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Excellent. Today, we're tackling those tricky verbs that can really make or break your fluency, how to express necessity, possibility, and obligation in French.
Ah, yes. The subtle art of devoir, pouvoir, and falloir.
Exactly. And we're not just exploring these verbs for fun, we're going deep so that you can ace that pronunciator library module and snag that certificate.
Sounds like a plan. Let's unlock those French skills.
Awesome. Now, I've been prepping for our deep dive, and devoir seems like a real chameleon. It's not just about must or have to. It can also hint at probability and even dive to the realm of moral obligation.
It's true. Devoir is definitely a multitasker.
Yeah, how does one little verb do all that?
Well, it's all about context. You have to look at the surrounding words, the situation, to really grasp what devoir is trying to tell you. Think of it like a Swiss Army knife of verbs. Each situation pulls out a different tool, a different shade of meaning.
Ooh, I like that analogy. So look, if I said, il doit être fatigué, I'm not saying he est tired, right?
Right.
But I'm kind of guessing he probably is based on something.
Exactly. You're spot on. That's devoir expressing a supposition, a really common way to use it in French.
It's like saying he must be tired, but without being 100% certain.
Exactly. And you'll hear this all the time in French conversations. It's a way to be a little less direct, a little more nuanced.
That makes a lot of sense. But then how do you tell the difference between a strong, you must do this kind of obligation versus a more gentle, you should do this suggestion?
That's where those subtle but oh so important differences in conjugation come in. Remember that example from the pronunciator module, the one about eating vegetables?
Oh yeah, I think I remember that one.
Tu devrais manger plus de légumes, right? That's a suggestion, a nudge towards better health, not a strict order.
Right. You should eat your veggies, but no one's going to stand over you and make sure you do.
Exactly. It's friendly advice. But if you shift the conjugation and say, tu dois être à la réunion à 8 heures, well, that's a whole different story. You are obligated to be at that meeting at 8 o'clock sharp. No wiggle room there.
Okay, so the way you conjugate devoir really helps signal how strong the obligation is.
Got it. But hold on, the pronunciator material also mentions devoir can express moral obligation. That's intriguing. Can you give me an example of that?
Of course. Imagine you see someone drop their wallet on the street. A typical reaction would be, on doit le lui rendre.
Yeah.
We ought to return it. It's not a legal obligation, but it feels like the right thing to do, right?
Yeah, totally. It's like saying we should return it because it's ethically the right thing to do, not because there's a law that says so.
Precisely. It's about what should be done, not just what has to be done. And devoir can express both of those ideas depending on how you use it.
So it's not just about rules and regulations, but also about ethics and doing the right thing. That adds a whole new dimension to the verb, doesn't it? It really does. And that's just one of the many reasons why mastering devoir is so essential if you want to truly understand the nuances of French.
It's like the more we explore devoir, the more layers we uncover. It's a fascinating verb.
Definitely a powerful one, and it's definitely worth taking the time to really understand.
Well, we can't stay with devoir forever, can we? We've got two other verbs to explore. So let's shift gears and move on to pouvoir, the verb of possibilities.
Ah, yes. Pouvoir is all about potential, what you can do, what might happen, and even how to ask for permission politely. It's a verb that opens doors, so to speak.
And speaking of politely asking for things, the pronunciator material really highlighted how essential pouvoir is in formal settings. Did you give us a quick rundown on how that works?
Absolutely. Imagine you're at a fancy French restaurant, you've enjoyed your meal, and now you want to ask for the check.
Now, you could bluntly say, je veux l'addition, which is like saying, I want the bill, but that can sound a bit demanding, don't you think?
Yeah, maybe a little too direct for a fancy place. Right. So instead, you'd use pouvoir and say, puis-je avoir l'addition, s'il vous plaît? Ooh, so much smoother. It's like saying, could I please have the bill?
Exactly. Using pouvoir in this way allows you to navigate those social niceties with grace and finesse.
It's like pouvoir transforms a demand into a polite request. It's a linguistic magic trick.
You got it. And this is just one of the many ways pouvoir can add a touch of elegance and nuance to your French.
I'm loving this. But pouvoir isn't just about asking permission politely, right? I remember from the module that it's also key for talking about hypothetical situations. What's a good example of that in action?
Okay, let's say you're daydreaming about your upcoming trip to France. You could say, si je pouvais parler français couramment, je pourrais commander tous mes plats préférés au restaurant. You're using pouvoir to express both a wish, if I could speak French fluently, and its potential outcome, I could order all my favorite dishes.
That's perfect. It's like saying, if I could speak French fluently, I could order all my favorite dishes. Pouvoir allows us to explore all those what-ifs and possibilities. Exactly. It's your passport to the world of possibilities and potential in French.
I'm starting to see why mastering these verbs is so key to sounding more natural in French. But there's one thing that tripped me up a bit in the pronunciator material. It mentioned this subtle difference between pouvoir and savoir when you're talking about ability. Can you explain that a little more?
Absolutely. It's a common point of confusion. Think of it like this. Pouvoir is about general ability, like je peux nager, I can swim. You're basically saying, I won't drown if I jump in the pool.
So it's like a baseline ability.
Exactly. But savoir, on the other hand, implies that you've learned the skill properly. Je sais nager means more than just I can swim. It suggests you've taken lessons, you have good technique, you're a competent swimmer.
Ah, okay, so savoir is a step up from pouvoir. It suggests a more intentional and developed skill.
Precisely. Native French speakers definitely pick up on this nuance. Understanding the difference between these two will help you sound more natural and express yourself more accurately.
This is fantastic. We've unpacked devoir and explored the potential of pouvoir. But we've still got one more verb to conquer, the mysterious falloir. And honestly, I'm a little intimidated by this one.
I get it. Falloir is a unique verb, but it's incredibly useful.
Okay, I'm ready to face my fears. Let's do this.
All right, let's demystify falloir. First things first, remember this falloir is always used in the third person singular form, il faut, and it means it is necessary.
So why can't we conjugate falloir like other verbs? What makes it so special?
The thing is, falloir is an impersonal verb, meaning it doesn't refer to a specific person performing the action. It expresses a kind of general necessity that applies to everyone.
Okay, that makes sense. So how would you use falloir in a sentence?
Well, a classic example is il faut manger pour vivre. One must eat to live. It doesn't really matter who is doing the eating. The necessity to eat applies to everyone, right?
Right, of course. It's a universal truth.
Exactly. And this impersonal nature of falloir is part of what makes it so powerful. It conveys a sense of, well, inevitability and obligation that goes beyond individual actions.
It's like it's a rule of the universe. But the pronunciator module also mentions falloir can be used to give advice or make suggestions. How does that work? It seems like it always implies a strict necessity.
It's true, falloir is often used to express necessity, but like our friend devoir, it can soften its tone depending on the context. For example, if you're with a friend who's stressed out, you might say, il faudrait te détendre un peu.
So it's more like a friendly suggestion you should relax a bit.
Exactly. It's a gentle nudge in the right direction, not a command. Mastering the subtle use of falloir can make your French sound more natural, less forceful.
This is great. But there's one part about falloir that still makes me a bit nervous, and that's its relationship with the subjunctive mood.
The subjunctive. It does tend to make learners a little uneasy.
Right. It's like, just when I think I'm getting a handle on French verbs, the subjunctive shows up and it's like, hold my baguette, things are about to get complicated.
I hear you. But the good news is there's usually a pattern with falloir and the subjunctive. It often pops up after the phrase il faut que. For example, il faut que tu pars maintenant. You must leave now. See how the subjunctive form of partir adds that extra emphasis on the necessity of the action.
So it's like adding an extra layer of this really needs to happen to the sentence.
Precisely. And that's a very common way to use falloir with the subjunctive.
Okay, it's starting to make sense. Falloir might be impersonal, but it definitely has a strong personality. And I think we've covered a lot of ground today, unpacking devoir, unlocking the potential of pouvoir, and even starting to demystify the enigmatic falloir.
We have. It's been a great deep dive so far, and I think we're ready for a quick break before we tackle even more of the nuances of these verbs.
Sounds like a plan. We'll be right back to continue our French grammar adventure after a short break.
Welcome back. Ready to keep exploring the world of devoir, pouvoir, and falloir.
Definitely. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
Well, we covered a lot in the first part, but you're right, there's so much more to discover.
Okay, so where should we head next on our deep dive?
How about we start with something fundamental to any language? Negation. How do you say, I don't have to work, or I can't go using those verbs?
Good point. Negation is essential. Plus, I always get a little tripped up with French negation, especially with all those different negative words.
It can seem a bit overwhelming at first, but it's actually quite logical. The basic formula is ne verbe pas. So I don't have to work would be je ne dois pas travailler. And I can't go would be je ne peux pas aller.
Okay, that part I can usually remember. You just got to sandwich the verb between no and pas.
Uh-huh.
But what about those other negations I see sometimes, like no dopli or no jamais? Do those work with these verbs too?
Absolutely. They add different shades of meaning to your negation. Ne plus means no longer or not anymore, while ne jamais means never. For instance, je ne peux plus manger means I can't eat anymore. Maybe you're full. And il ne faut jamais dire jamais is a classic French proverb meaning never say never.
Ooh, I like that one. I always love a good proverb. Okay, so negations, check. What about pronouns? How do those work with these verbs, especially when they're followed by infinitives? That's where I always seem to get stuck.
Pronouns can be a bit tricky, but there's the key rule to remember. Object pronouns always go before the infinitive in French.
So if I want to say I have to do it, it would be je dois le faire. The pronoun le, meaning it, goes before the infinitive faire, meaning to do.
Exactly. And this rule applies even with double object pronouns. For example, je dois te le donner. I have to give it to you. Both te and le come before the infinitive donor.
Wow, that's a lot of pronouns. But I see the pattern. They like to snuggle up close to their infinitives.
That's a great way to remember it. And once you understand this, building complex sentences with these verbs becomes much easier.
This is all making more sense. But before we move on, I have another question about word order. What happens when you have devoir or pouvoir followed by an infinitive and another verb? It's like a verb traffic jam. How do you figure out the right order?
Ah, those verb clusters. They can seem intimidating. But there's a pattern here too. The conjugated verb, either devoir or pouvoir, always comes first, followed by the infinitive and then the final verb. It's like a little verb conga line.
Okay, so to use an example from my life, if I wanted to say I have to go see the doctor, it would be je dois aller voir le médecin.
Exactly. Devoir leads the way, followed by the infinitive aller and then the final verb voir.
It's like those verbs are doing a little dance across the sentence.
You could say that. Now, speaking of how verbs move and interact, I was looking back at the pronunciator material and it mentioned something interesting. Remember how we talked about auxiliary verbs, those helpful verbs like être and avoir that show up in compound tenses?
Yeah, I remember that. They team up with the main verb to express more complex time frames.
Exactly. Well, it turns out that even the tense of those auxiliary verbs can affect the meaning of devoir, pouvoir, and falloir in compound tenses. I thought that was pretty fascinating.
Oh, I'm curious about that. I always struggle a bit with compound tenses.
They can be tricky, but basically it's a teamwork situation. The auxiliary verb tells you when something happened, while the main verb devoir, pouvoir, or falloir expresses the necessity, possibility, or obligation. They work together to convey the complete meaning.
Okay, I get the teamwork part. But how does the actual choice of être or avoir as the auxiliary change things?
Well, first off, the choice depends on the main verb. With devoir and pouvoir, you'll always use avoir. For falloir, it's always être. But it's the tense of that auxiliary verb that will really pinpoint exactly when the necessity, possibility, or obligation took place.
Can you give some examples? I think that might help it click for me.
Of course. Let's stick with devoir for now. If you say, j'ai dû partir, using avoir in the passé composé, it means I had to leave. But if you say j'avais dû partir, using avoir in the plus que parfait, it means I had to leave. So it puts that obligation further back in the past.
Ah, I see. So the tense of the auxiliary verb is like a time machine, taking the obligation further back in time.
Exactly. And the same idea applies to pouvoir and falloir. The auxiliary verb helps paint the backdrop of when the possibility or necessity took place.
This is starting to make much more sense. I'm feeling a lot more confident about using these verbs in different ways. But I have to admit, I still get a little intimidated thinking about actually using them in real-life conversations.
I understand. It takes time and practice to feel truly comfortable with these verbs. But remember, every step you take on this deep dive is a step closer to mastering them.
You're right. I need to embrace the challenge and keep practicing. I'm actually feeling pretty motivated to tackle the next part of our deep dive. What else do we have in store?
Let's jump in and see what other fascinating facets of these verbs we can uncover.
All right, welcome back to our French grammar deep dive. I have to say, after exploring devoir, pouvoir, and falloir in parts 1 and 2, I'm feeling way more confident about these verbs.
That's great to hear. I think we've covered a lot of the tricky parts.
We really have, and I feel like I'm finally starting to understand the subtle ways these verbs can shape meaning in French.
It's those subtleties that really unlock fluency, don't you think?
Absolutely. But I know there are always more layers to uncover, more nuances to explore.
You're definitely right about that. I was actually looking back at some of the questions in the pronunciator material, and one caught my eye. It was about how common time expressions, phrases like d'ici demain, by tomorrow, or avant lundi, before Monday, can affect sentences with these verbs.
I hadn't really thought about that before.
It's easy to overlook, but these little phrases can add so much nuance to the way you express necessity, possibility, and obligation.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Sure, let's say you're talking about a deadline. You could say, je dois finir ce projet, meaning I have to finish this project. But if you add d'ici demain to the end, it becomes, je dois finir ce projet d'ici demain. I have to finish this project by tomorrow. It adds that extra layer of urgency.
Right. It's like saying, no excuses, it has to be done by tomorrow.
Exactly. And you can do the same thing with pouvoir. Instead of just saying, je pourrais peut-être aller au cinéma, I might be able to go to the cinema, you can add avant lundi to create, je pourrais peut-être aller au cinéma avant lundi, I might be able to go to the cinema before Monday.
So you're not just saying it's possible, you're giving it a time frame.
Precisely. Those time expressions act like markers, adding a more precise sense of when something can or must happen.
So it's all about those layers of meaning, again, using those little phrases to be extra clear.
Exactly. It's what makes French so fascinating. Those little details can really elevate your fluency and make your French sound more natural.
I'm definitely taking notes on that one. While we're talking about those finer points of French, I want to circle back to something we discussed earlier, the difference between savoir and pouvoir when we're talking about ability. The pronunciator module pointed out how tricky that can be for learners.
Oh, definitely a common stumbling block. It's all about remembering that pouvoir is about general ability, while savoir implies that you have a specific skill or knowledge.
Right. So pouvoir is like being able to, and savoir is more like knowing how to.
Exactly. If you say, je peux nager, I can swim, you're basically saying that you're capable of swimming. You won't sink like a rock if you jump in the water. But if you say, je sais nager, I know how to swim, it implies that you've actually learned the proper techniques, you've taken lessons, maybe you even have a cool swimming scope.
So savoir is about having that expertise.
Precisely. You're not just capable, you're competent. It's a subtle but important distinction.
That makes perfect sense. Thanks for clearing that up. Now, before we wrap things up, I want to revisit falloir for a moment. I remember the pronunciator material mentioned some common expressions using falloir to talk about everyday obligations. Can you give us a few examples?
Absolutely. You'll often hear falloir in expressions that describe those everyday things we need to do, like il faut se lever tôt pour aller travailler. One must wake up early to go to work.
Oh yeah, that's definitely a familiar obligation.
It's a universal truth for many of us, right? And another common one is il faut faire les courses. One must do the grocery shopping. It's another one of those essential tasks we all have to do.
It's amazing how falloir can express both those big universal necessities and the little everyday ones too.
It really is a versatile verb, and as you can see, it pops up all over the place in French.
Well, we've covered so much ground today, from conjugations and negations to pronouns, infinitives, and even those subtle time expressions. I feel like I have a whole new level of understanding of devoir, pouvoir, and falloir. And most importantly, I'm actually excited to tackle that pronunciator module now.
That's fantastic. I'm so glad to hear that. And remember, the key to mastering any language, especially those tricky verbs, is practice. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, experiment, and really immerse yourself in the language.
You're right. The more I practice, the more natural it will become. Well, I think that brings our French grammar deep dive to a close. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you feel as empowered as I do to keep exploring the beautiful and fascinating world of French.
Au revoir et à bientôt.